Hey, welcome back. Today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the topic of accountability. And I'm talking about accountability at the federal level for our students who are English learners. There have been a lot of recent law changes, a lot of shifts, and as a result, a lot of confusion about exactly what are we accountable for when we're talking about accountability for the education of English learners. So in our Every Student Succeeds Act, which establishes our new laws for accountability nationwide, there are items in that law that address English learners specifically. So because there have been some changes from No Child Left Behind to ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, I'll take a few minutes and walk through those just to give everyone an idea of things you need to be considering and plans that should be in place to address these different points in your school or your school district to make sure that you are compliant with the law and that you're moving along and changing with the changes in the law. I wanted to share with you a resource that really sums up the big ideas in a short passage that you can read. And I will share some information from this with you, but I want you to have it as well. So let me share my screen with you for a minute. This is probably the most concise summary of the changes about how ESSA will impact serving ELL students. So it's from Education Dive, and we'll put the link in our blog notes here, but educationdive.com, 4 ways ESSA will change how schools serve ELL students. It's a great summary of the main points that we're going to talk about today. So this is a new law following No Child Left Behind. And No Child Left Behind was the first federal recognition of having some accountability for English learners. So while having laws that involve assessments and testing and all of that accountability is uncomfortable and controversial at times, it really was a great thing for English learners because it's the first time that people had to pay attention. Schools are always overwhelmed with the needs in front of them, and those that involve accountability and are measured get attention first. And so adding English learners to that was really helpful for our students. So let's talk about the big ideas, how things have shifted under ESSA. So the biggest shift is that the accountability that was there in No Child Left Behind was explained consistently nationwide, but how each state and district interpreted that law and how they put it into action varied greatly across the country. So under ESSA, there are much stricter guidelines for states so that there's much more consistency from state to state and a lot more consistency within a state between the districts so that we are all coming up with very similar means of identifying students, of whether they are English learners or not, if they qualify for language development services, what those services can and should be is becoming much more consistently communicated. And then how will we know when students have reached a level of proficiency where they no longer require those services? That is becoming much more standardized across the states and country as well. The second area where students are being monitored more is under the state assessments. So our students have to take state assessments, all students. That's another federal accountability measure for all students in our classrooms. Our student success on those assessments is calculated and measured by various subgroups. So you have boys and girls, you have different ethnic areas, you'll have students of poverty, you'll have English learners, you have students with disabilities. There's a lot of different groups that students fall into that are monitored. So common sense tells us that our English learners are not going to do as well on a state test if they're not proficient in English. So We know that, and we've been kind of through data penalizing schools for having large numbers of English learners or for having English learners in general, because that, of course, their data is not going to be great. They're not going to do well on those tests right up front without the English. Once we get the proficiency level up there, they stand the same fighting chance as our other students. So one tweak in the law from No Child Left Behind to ESSA is that for the first 2 years a student is in the country, we're using a different kind of growth formula versus expecting those students to meet proficiency on our state assessments. So for the first 2 years, students are still taking the assessments and they are still included in accountability measures, but they're included in growth models rather than met or not met. By year 3, English learners become part of the whole test-taking group, and they are measured and held accountable in the same ways as all other student groups. So this is a step in the right direction. In my opinion, according to research, all the research that's out there, we know that 2 years is not enough time for students to become proficient in English, to be successful on the assessment, but it is a step in the right direction to recognize that we need to make sure our students are growing, but we have to be reasonable in our expectations that we aren't punishing schools for something that is brain research and very well documented. Another piece that changed in the law is the accountability for English learners has always been held under Title III, and that comes with funding, with federal funding as well. With ESSA, the accountability is moved under Title I. Title I encompasses all the services and funding for students of poverty. Combining Title I and Title III together really gives those programs more flexibility. Title I has a much more established background, usually a stronger understanding of the laws and accountability. Schools tend to understand that law better because it's been in every school for longer than we've had schools with large populations of English learners. And Title I comes with a significantly higher funding than Title III. So all of those are bonuses under ESSA, that we're pulling those groups together. There'll be more access to expertise, more access to funding, more access to services, and it coordinates a lot more. It will also allow for us to keep better track of students who fall into more than one category. Many of our Title III students are also Title I students. So we're talking about the same students anyway in some cases, and it helps to put that together. Another change in the accountability is that under ESSA, we are keeping track of our student growth in English proficiency and toward success on academic assessments for all of our identified English learners and students who have exited the English Language Development Program and they're 4 years after. Under No Child Left Behind, we monitored students for an additional 2 years after release, and that's been increased for 4 years after release, which will really give us a good span of time to really judge student growth. So let's say, for example, we have a student who's in an ESL program, English Language Development Program, for 4 years, and they become what the state considers approaching native English speaker proficiency, and they're released from the program. We monitor them for 4 more years. We get an 8-year span of monitoring that student to really ensure that language and academics are coming together for them. So that is, again, a lot more realistic with what research says than what we were doing in the past. Another shift under reporting of how we report data is that under No Child Left Behind, our schools always were accountable for subgroups. and LEP, Limited English Proficient, is the name federally of our subgroup with English learners. So that accountability has been there for quite a while. The difference is in the past, under No Child Left Behind, we were accountable at a district level and a state level and a federal level. Under ESSA, that accountability now moves all the way down to the school level. So schools, in their ratings of success, in how they're measured to be successful programs or not, are now accountable for their school level English learner success, which is new. So in the past, as a district administrator, I would get that information as a district, and I would really have to dig around a little bit more and try to figure out which schools were carrying us and which schools were kind of pulling it down and who was struggling and who was successful. Where now that data comes out right at the school level, and it'll be much clearer where our English learner programs are successful and where they're not. That comes with a lot of pressure on schools, but it comes with also some ability to then make a plan and have some control and make a difference for our students. It also becomes a flag in the civil rights world that we really do have to make sure each school is meeting the needs of all their students, and this kind of accountability helps keep track of that. For the first time, we now have a difference in accountability, or we do break out the subgroups of English learners, students with disabilities, and then students who are dual identified, which means we have students who are English learners who also are identified as students with disabilities. In the past, that group was all lumped into English learner, and they were all lumped into students with disabilities, but there was no accounting for the significant difference that happens from an English-speaking student with a disability to a student learning English and having a disability. There is a difference in how things happen, what can happen, and the time frame in which they happen. And so this is the first time that the law does break down that dual identified subgroup, which gives us a little bit more fair picture of progress and achievement for our students. I think the last piece that is a little different, districts usually keep track of their long-term English learners. So long-term English learners are students who have been in an English language development program for 5 years or more. So if students are starting in kindergarten and they go through kindergarten, first, second, third, fourth grade, and they are still not exiting the program, then we start to get concerned that they may not be keeping pace with what research says is usually the case. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And there will be some students, like students with disabilities or students who have had large breaks in their education, or, there's a lot of different factors that come into play. We do get to account for that. It's not 100% pass rate, but we are required now to monitor those students who have been in a program for more than 5 years and really start figuring out why that's happening and drilling down, breaking down that information to find out what's going on and how can we implement a stronger program in the first 5 years so that we get students to English proficiency as fast as possible. And the faster they get there, the better for the student, because each year that academic gap will widen if they don't have access to everything through the English language. So I hope this helps you understand some of the shifts in the new law. If you have any questions or you want to talk about it, brainstorm about it, there are pros and cons to every piece of this. There is research for and against every piece of this. This is what the law is, and down the road we'll keep talking about how we look at each of those pieces of data and how we can influence them by being the best teachers we can be for our English learners and for all students. So again, we'll put the link to this article. It's a great summary of the changes in the law that you can use in your leadership team meetings your school improvement team meetings, of how you might address these pieces of data in your school report cards, your school data reports, because now the level of accountability is turned up under ESSA. So reach out anytime if you want to brainstorm some ideas for your school improvement plan, or you want to think about what your teachers might need to impact this data and accountability down the road. We're here for you. So I will see you again next time. Thank you for joining us today.